So it started all the way back in 2014 in Ferguson when I was first introduced to this concept of poor people being abused by the courts. In this case, particularly poor Black people in North St. Louis County who often got traffic tickets and other minor offenses and were regularly arrested and rearrested and spent time in jail, often because they couldn't afford to keep up with all of these traffic tickets. Many of us, as we were watching the protests unveil themselves on the streets in Ferguson and St. Louis, became sort of introduced to this idea for the first time of cities using their police forces and their municipal courts as fundraising tools. And then a couple of years later, in 2017 and 2018, I came across a couple of cases in rural Missouri involving poor white Missourians in which they were sent back to jail after they had been convicted of a minor misdemeanor, but because they had gotten a bill for their time in jail. And that is a statute that I didn't realize existed. A lot of lawyers that I talked to didn't realize it existed. And in fact, every state in the nation, except for New Hampshire, has a similar statute that allows cities and counties and in some cases, state prisons to charge people for their time in jail. And what was happening in Missouri, and what I since found out is happening in states all over the country, is that people are put back in jail when they can't afford to pay for court costs, including sometimes a bill for jail. And these fines and fees that are added to the court system, primarily for poor people charged with minor misdemeanors, create this whole cycle of poverty and debt that is impossible for people to escape. And it is literally the state using the tyranny of big government to put people in debtor's prison. And as I started writing these stories, I would hear from people and get tips on, oh my gosh, you need to talk to my cousin in Dent County and Caldwell County and St. Francis County. And I found that the poor people in these counties that were the victims of the system, they all knew about it. They just figured, well, this is the way it works. And in fact, unfortunately, one of the things I point out in my book is that's how the criminal justice system works all across the country. We have cities and counties using their police departments and their municipal courts and their county and district courts as fundraising tools, as backdoor taxes. And the victims are real people charged with minor events who end up having devastating consequences in their lives because they end up spending time in jail long after they've served their time because they owe a bunch of money that is being collected for a bunch of things that have absolutely nothing to do with the crime they were charged with, because our governments want to use the courts as a way to raise money.
I want to get to the specific cases that you outlined too, but is this a function? I mean, because usually you think like, oh, well, if you're looking to steal some money, you go to a place where there's the most money. In this instance, you're going to the place where there isn't the most money, but maybe there's the least amount of power to do anything about it. How much of a hole, I guess, is there in the budgets of, and a lot of this has to do with rural areas in particular, relative to what it was years ago? I mean, in other words, like how much of a need is out there that they stumbled upon this? If it is a function of trying to raise money?
Well, it's interesting. You hit on something that I talk about in the book, and that is that using fines and fees to fund government is horribly inefficient because 80% of the people in the court system happen to be poor. We know that because of statistics where they qualify for the public defender system. And so you're literally talking about governments trying to tax its poorest citizens and not doing a very good job of it in terms of raising money. There was a study in New Mexico that looked at how much it costs to try to raise money this way and found out that governments are spending more money trying to collect fines and fees than they're actually bringing in. And so it's a really bad system. But the reason that it continues is because the legislatures that pass these laws that allow the fines and fees to get out of control, people come to them, various constituencies come to them and say, hey, look, we need money for X, Y, or Z. And those legislatures, many of them, a lot of the states that I write about in the book, Missouri, Oklahoma, South Carolina, prominently, all three states with conservative legislatures that are generally anti-tax. Their state lawmakers have all signed Grover Norquist's "I'm never going to raise taxes ever again in the history of my life, no matter what" pledge. And so when somebody comes to them, like a group of retired sheriffs who want to increase their retirement fund, rather than go to the general revenue, which is how most government services are funded, lawmakers say, well, we'll just add a $3 fee to all the court cases. And the poor people end up paying for that fee. And that $3 fee gets added to a $10 fee and a $5 fee and a $15 fee. And all of these things add up, and they end up to a cycle of poverty for poor people where they end up being put back in jail. And so what's happening is that the left hand and the right hand, none of them are really talking. The sheriffs go to the legislature and the legislature add this fee. The fee gets added. The Supreme Court says, here's the list of fees you're allowed to collect. The local judge gets that list. And when they get a defendant in front of them, say, well, you're supposed to owe this money. You have to pay this money. And rather than waive it because they're poor or even have an ability to pay hearing to determine whether or not they should be paying those fees, they just accept as part of the regular course of action. We're tough on crime. You came before us. You owe us this money. If you don't pay us this money, we're going to put you back in jail. And that's exactly what they do. And they do it over and over and over again with devastating consequences until lawmakers or civil rights attorneys or Supreme Courts step up and say, wait a minute, this is wrong. This is debtor's prison. We outlawed those in the 1800s. We're not supposed to do this. But it takes a tremendous amount of effort, as I outline in the book, in Missouri and in Oklahoma and South Carolina. I write about a case in Idaho where the Supreme Court said, hey, you know what? We're not going to allow this anymore. It takes a tremendous amount of effort to get folks to really recognize, wait a minute, we're putting people in jail because they're poor. Why are we doing this? What are we going to do to undo this scheme?
So you mentioned debtors' prisons there, and that's really, of course, the first thing that comes to my mind, right? This is a modern day debtors' prison. They're supposed to be illegal. Has there been since this, I guess this would be a 14th Amendment violation here for equal protection? Like, has there been a challenge, a 14th Amendment challenge to these? Because it seems to me that this violates precedent when debtors' prisons were made illegal.
Yeah, so two of the federal lawsuits that I write about, one of them in Oklahoma and one of them in South Carolina, specifically bring 14th Amendment violations to the court. The problem is, if you ask a judge who's putting a poor person in jail because they're poor, if they're sending them to debtor's prison, the judge says, oh, no. See, this person missed a hearing, so I'm sending them to court because they missed a hearing. And then you ask further, well, what was that hearing for? Well, that hearing was to collect money for fines and fees. Or that hearing was to determine whether or not they had a probation violation because they couldn't afford to pay for their ankle bracelet, or they couldn't afford to pay for their private for-profit probation company that was charging them $30 a month for drug testing. All of these things that lead to people ending up back in jail, sometimes on pretextual reasons, i.e. they missed a court date, they had a warrant out for their arrest, they failed a drug test. All of them have to do with the underlying reason of we're collecting fines and fees from poor people and requiring them to come to court month after month after their cases have been adjudicated. And it's amazing. If you go to any jurisdiction in this country on a day where a judge has what they call their law day, where, you know, people who got all of these summons have to show up.